Hello everybody and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. Another round of trilateral peace talks between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and Ukraine is behind us. Economic issues are among the more key issues, and among other things, that's what we'll be talking about today with our guest, Professor Anders Åslund. Let's go ahead and start off though with an overview of all the highlights coming straight out of Ukraine this week.
Russia is apparently gearing up for a new offensive in Ukraine's Sumy and Kharkiv regions this spring. President Zelensky has reported that preparations for the push are already underway, with Moscow aiming to regain lost ground. The attack was initially planned 8 months ago but was delayed due to Ukraine's advances in the Kursk region. Both northeastern regions have long been key battlegrounds. Last year, Russia launched an offensive in Kharkiv but failed to gain significant ground. In August, Ukrainian forces pushed into Kursk, seizing 1,300 square kilometers of Russian soil. However, this March, Russian troops reinforced by North Korean units launched a counteroffensive to reclaim lost territory. European reassurance forces will be stationed in Ukraine as a deterrent against Russia, said French President Emmanuel Macron after a summit of the Coalition of the Willing in Paris. While France and the UK vowed to commit troops, other European leaders are considering the initiative with caution, as the nature and extent of the troops' involvement is not yet known. Meanwhile, the EU is still working to shore up its defense capabilities amid mounting tensions on the continent. Recent Russian attacks across Ukraine left at least 1 dead and over 130 people wounded, with the heaviest assaults recorded in Kharkiv, Donetsk and Kherson. Kharkiv saw significant damage, including a fire at an industrial facility and injuries sustained by 23 people. In Kherson, 5 were wounded and an elderly woman was killed by a drone strike. Russian missiles and drones targeted infrastructure, including schools and residential buildings in Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk. The strike in Sumy wounded over 100, including 23 children. Ukrainian forces have actively tried repelling the assaults with air defense assets, electronic warfare and mobile units. Ukraine's defense ministry has reported that its strike on Russia's Engels 2 airfield destroyed 96 air-launched cruise missiles, including Kh-101s meant for upcoming strikes on Ukrainian soil. The attack caused a fire and multiple secondary explosions, damaging ammunition storage depots and aviation fuel supplies. Engels 2, located in Saratov, is a key base for Russia's strategic bombers, including Tu-95s. In another success, Ukrainian forces targeted Russian command centers in Kursk, killing a battalion commander. Fighting has been continuous in the region following Ukraine's incursion in August 2024. Meanwhile, US and European intelligence agencies have disputed claims from Russia and President Trump, arguing Ukraine's unfavorable position in the area. Another round of US-Ukraine negotiations concluded in Riyadh on March 25th. The meeting, led by Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, followed 12-hour US-Russia talks held the day before. Discussions reportedly focused on military, diplomatic and energy issues, but no details have been made public. The talks are part of US President Donald Trump's broader push for a ceasefire in Ukraine. A temporary halt on attacks against energy facilities and Black Sea operations was reportedly agreed upon, but Ukraine has since accused Russia of violating the deal. Relations between Kiev and Washington had become strained after a clash between Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office. However, US military aid has resumed after the 30-day ceasefire deal was reached, and relations between the two leaders are reportedly back on track. Ukraine's defense ministry has announced that its domestically developed bird of prey unmanned aerial system has been approved for combat operations. The drone is optimized to target enemy vehicles and fortified positions, including tanks, armored personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery and bunkers. The bird of prey has already proven effective on the battlefield. Over the past year, Ukraine has significantly expanded its domestic drone manufacturing, integrating the systems into both reconnaissance and combat roles. In February, Ukraine's defense ministry launched a drone line initiative to accelerate the UAV's battlefield deployment. Ukraine has also developed long-range missile drone hybrids like Palanitsia and Peklo with a target of producing 30,000 long-range drones in 2025.
And now joining us on Ukraine this week to discuss all the economic factors at play is Professor Anders Åslund, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Hello, Professor. Great to see you, and thanks for coming on today.
Thank you. My pleasure, as always.
Yes. Now, looking at this latest economic treaty proposal, I mean, we saw the evolution now of the minerals deal that was signed off first, the minerals deal. Now it's morphed into something else. I'd like to get your assessment on what this latest version entails and whether it's even can be considered by Ukrainians.
Yeah, no, this is a truly outrageous proposal. Essentially, it would take away Ukraine's sovereignty. It means that the US would have the right to claim any kind of bids of resources in Ukraine. It seems as if all resources, this includes the whole infrastructure, electricity, oil, gas, and minerals. So it seems to be almost the whole state-owned sector in Ukraine. That should be considered due to the Americans. And the aim of the funding should be that Ukraine pays for all the assistance it has got as grants from the US under Biden, which is outrageous. And here Trump claims $350 billion. The documents don't contain any number, but $100 billion is probably a more correct number. And the US is not guaranteeing any sovereignty, any security, or any financing. And it will get the first bid on any resources that are being offered to the market by the Ukrainian state. And if the US says no, then nobody else should be allowed to bid on it for 1 year. So this is straightforward and extortionary and colonial proposals that is absolutely unacceptable. My guess would be that the Ukrainian government will just say, oh, we have to discuss it. It's completely unacceptable. And since Ukraine is a democracy, it would have to be the parliament that approves of any agreement, and the parliament will not agree to such a proposal. So I guess that we will see a pretty meaningless negotiation because the Ukrainians don't want the Americans to once again stop deliveries of intelligence and arms.
Yes, I remember back being in Kyiv for the third-year anniversary of the full-scale, and of course, one of the things that President Zelensky was saying at the time was that it wasn't very clear whether the United States could flip this agreement and actually turn it over to the Russian hands. I imagine this is probably, there's a similar concern in here. Another thing I'd like to point out and get your opinion on is that this deal would essentially block access to the EU. How do you think that's so?
Yeah, that's an important additional aspect. So this would block EU accession, and it would also block EU rights to invest, since the US would have a first right to everything. But I would argue that it's even worse. Today, President Putin said that he would like to see the UN taking over Ukraine and organize new democratic elections in the Ukraine. And we know what Putin means by democratic elections. that is elections that he controls. And my fear is that President Trump, who behaves entirely as a servant of Mr. Putin, that he and Putin are simply trying to take over Ukraine and make it a joint protectorate by the Americans and the Russians, or perhaps only by the Russians. So the US has turned from being the key ally to behave like an enemy and an ally of Russia.
Indeed, it is very unfortunate. What is Ukraine to do at this point? We saw the blow up in the White House. We saw President Zelensky come back, presumably apologize to Donald Trump, but also then go to Jeddah and get on board with the U.S. demand, I guess, if we could put it that way, to go on and commit to a full-on ceasefire. Ukraine did that. Russia comes back and is not all the way there, making, again, some ridiculous demands. But now with this on the table, what does Ukraine do with its relationship with the United States? Can it look closer to Europe, and can it rely on Europe to really have its back in this situation?
Yeah, these are the key questions. With regard to the US, as I just said, I think that the best option for Ukraine is to just long haul the negotiations as Putin is now doing. The best hope is that Putin embarrasses the US eventually, because Putin has made no concessions whatsoever. And today he came up with a wonderful proposal to include North Korea in the peace and negotiations. And why not China and India, etc., friendly countries to Russia. So Putin might turn these negotiations into a farce so that the Trump administration just quietly withdrawn. And this is, I think, the best option for Ukraine, so that it doesn't come to an open conflict between Ukraine and Trump, which is, so to say, the actual situation. And then Ukraine needs to mobilize Europe as much as possible, as has been done now under the leadership of Prime Minister Starmer of Britain and President Macron of France. But they have to figure out that they need to take the Russian assets of $300 billion that is in the West. And it was yesterday that Macron said, no, that is not possible. He needs to rethink. It's perfectly possible, it's just, and it's legally permissible.
Right, and we see these signals coming out of the Trump administration from various officials saying that the EU only has a place at the table because it has sanctions in place on Russia. However, I would like to explore the situation with sanctions and the possibility that the Trump administration could give sanctions relief to Russia as some kind of reward for presumably sitting down at the table. In the event that this happens, we know that the Europeans said in Paris yesterday that no sanctions relief is on the table at this time. But is there a remote possibility that the United States could take off some of the sanctions that have been enacted since the full-scale invasion?
They can take out some sanctions, in particular sanctions on people. The US has sanctioned about 2,000 Russians, and they can give the priority to top oligarchs that Putin tends to give preference to. But that does not matter all that much. What's important is what is happening on the economic side. SWIFT is controlled by the Europeans. The US cannot end those sanctions on its own. The US had minimal trade with Russia, and it will not increase simply because of distance and the commodity composition of their trade. And the US is very much a competitor when it comes to energy trade, which is the most important. So Europe has a very strong position, and in this regard, Europe is quite united with one single exception, Viktor Orban of Hungary.
Right. Let's hope within the auspices, I guess, of the coalition of the willing that the Europeans will figure out how to, let's say, avoid Viktor Orban and go outside the EU. But looking back at Russia and the economic consequences that all of these sanctions, this 3 years of war, Russia's in a war footing and its economy has huge inflation right now. Economic growth is bleak. What are your current assessments for the Russian economy in the event that we continue business as usual, which means sanctions remain in place, the war continues throughout the year?
The Russian economy is actually in a worse shape than the Ukrainian economy because Ukraine has ample access to international financing. Russia has no access to international financing. Russia is running out of its liquid reserves this year. They were $38 billion at the beginning of the year. That is enough to cover the budget deficit for 1 year in Russia. So second half of this year, Russia will have to face serious budget cuts. And either they hit once again the social sector, and then you wonder how much can the Russians really take? Well, a lot, as we know, but there are some limits. It's clear that Russians are very wary of a war, though at the same time they hope for a victory. Everybody wants to be victorious in a war, but there's no enthusiasm for the war left in Russia as far as we can see. The economy is likely to grow by 1% this year, and it will be entirely the military sector. Standard of living will decline. And as you mentioned, inflation is high and will stay high.
Well, we'll have to see where this year takes us. I know it's anybody's guess at this point. Sure has been a rocky start to this new administration. Professor Anders Åslund, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest adventures in the war in Ukraine. Thanks for joining, and see you then. Goodbye.